man must see there are trials, he must know when there are troubles, he must meet, he must stare in the eyes of evil, know that he is free till the good Lord calls, keep on wandering.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage filmmaker, author, and television host, Holly Morris.
Hello, good morning. Everyone hear me? Great to be here. I hope it's been a good conference for everybody. I am so pleased to be here back in my hometown of Chicago and talk to you about the business of saving places. It's really something that is close to my heart in a funny way, and we're going to talk about it through the context of Chernobyl, a place that I think we can all agree is arguably maybe not exactly worth saving. Especially in these times of unprecedented displaced peoples around the globe, whether it's from poverty or environmental disaster or war, I think it's an apt time to be taking on some of these issues. But I'm in the business of saving stories, and you're in the business of saving places, so hopefully over the next hour or so we can make some progress. So we're going to start by going back in time to 1986. As you can see, my first slide is up, and we are at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. I'm going to click this and hope that this works. There we go. That is the sound of a dosimeter. As you can see, what we have is Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the background, in the foreground, a Geiger counter or dosimeter. You have to have one at any time when you're in the zone, and that noise becomes sort of ubiquitous there. Here you can see that, sorry, this is it's an unlikely place to talk about, it's an unlikely place to sort of grapple with the ideas of wellness and place. Sorry, I'm getting a rough start here. Whoop, not moving. There we go, let's go back a little bit. Not moving on, fellas, can you help me? There we go. So, I'm a journalist, a filmmaker, and I was first in Chernobyl in 2010. So you know, you don't know me, but that look on my face is not journalistic grit or determination to get the story. It's pure fear. Standing in front of the reactor, it is a, there's a lot of, this is called the sarcophagus that is over reactor number 4, and there's radioactive dust that's blowing out of that. So I'm there, in the middle of essentially a radioactive police state. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And I'm thinking, I just want to get the hell out of there, right? Every time you go into the zone, you have to pass through radiation detectors, and every time you leave the zone, you also have detectors. I put this photo up only because what's interesting about it to me is, well, let's put it this way. Every time, I probably went through there probably 20 times in the course of making my film, The Babushkas of Chernobyl, and about a third of those times it was unplugged. So, in the context of the lesson for a group like you, you can put the tools and infrastructure of health in place, but if the humans in charge don't buy in, well, the machine might as well be unplugged. Now, the zone this isn't a typical abandoned house inside the zone. It's a strange place. There are sort of scattered ghost villages everywhere. It's eerie, bucolic, beautiful, creepy, totally contaminated. Many villages were bulldozed at the time of the accident. That was their first sort of effort at remediation. They were buried under. But others, like this one, sort of sit as silent vestiges to the tragedy. So you get the idea. It's a restricted, lifeless, without culture or living history. I mean, this sign drives home the point that there should be no people living anywhere near the dead zone. But the thing is, they are. In villages like this. So, on that first trip that I took to Chernobyl in 2010, I'd stumbled across the reality that there was a community inside the zone, which immediately captured my attention and became the beginning of the film. It's a typical homestead. You know, the people there defied common sense authorities in 1986 to return to their ancestral homes inside the zone. Now, 1,200 people returned to the zone in the months and weeks after the accident. And today, a little more than 30 years since then, a little over 100 survive. Now, when I first went into a village, I met this woman, Hanna Zavorotnia. She was busy when I met her. She is the self-declared mayor of Kupovate village, population 8. I guess my first question going in when I started meeting people was, I lack the expertise that many of you have here in the audience, and my question, are these people ignorant or crazy or both? It was about that simple. I was really 2 years away from understanding the fierce ties to place that drive, inform, and even sustain a life. So Hannah made short work of the pig, which I'm going to very briefly show you the next picture. It's pretty graphic. I've never actually shown this picture because it is a bit graphic, but in a way it epitomizes the resilience of the people inside the zone and people working together to survive, which is what happened, how we got to this moment. The other thing that happened on the first day I met Hannah was there was this hawk hanging above her chicken coop. She explained to me that when it messed with her chickens, she beat it to death and strung it up as a warning to other hawks who might get any ideas. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Hannah's homestead. She, as the years gone on, lots of people were evacuated and accepted relocation, but also people are passing away. Again, there were 1,200 people coming back in after the accident. By the time I was there, 230. So the houses are empty. So Hannah had one house full of potatoes, one house full of her pickled goods, one house where she was boiling the pig. So real estate was repurposed pretty significantly. Now, Hannah also lives with her sister, disabled sister, who she's been taking care of for some 40 years now. So we're in her house, and I ask Hannah the obvious question, about living inside the radioactive zone. And she says, "Radiation doesn't scare me, starvation does." And proceeded to serve me another heap of steaming dumplings and moonshine. The next photo is Hannah and her sister-in-law and Maria. And they've been friends since girlhood. Now, when a soldier nabbed Maria back in '86 when she was trying to get back into her village, she said, "Shoot me and dig the grave, otherwise I'm staying." Now, you have to remember, these are women who have survived the worst atrocities of the 20th century, Stalin's enforced famines of the 1930s, which killed millions of Ukrainians. The Holodomor, that was called. After that, they faced the Nazis in the 40s who moved across raping, killing, and many of these women were sent to Germany as forced labor. So in '86, when Chernobyl happened, and they were being evacuated, they were simply unwilling to leave in the face of an enemy that was invisible. Now, life in the zone is difficult. There's a lot of hardship, there's a lot of suffering and sadness. People cannot, the children, anyone under 18 can only come once a year. And of course, their grandchildren they rarely see. Their own children, adult children, if they have them, if they're lucky enough to have them in the region, come in frequently. So there is a lot of isolation and sadness, which makes their micro community, their microhood, all that more important. So, you know, social cohesion among this group is everything, really, despite their diminishing numbers. And they really articulate it in a very high-spirited way. I'm going to show you a quick clip from the film. Oh, that's not it. Sorry, guys. Here we go.
Танцуйте, жовті туфлі, почивати, танцювати, замуж віду, плакати, буду, вам підходить щось стоять. Ой, грає гармоніст, грай голуб'йоночак, ти не кидаю хажорки, є п'яня мільйоночак. Хватит.
I hear a lot of laughing. That was just supposed to be a high-spirited moment, but humor, I have to say, there was so much of it inside the zone. It's a place we only think of generally as suffering and death, and there is a lot of that. But as a filmmaker, I did run into some problems when I was like, God, they're really funny, and how do you make a funny Chernobyl film? And it's not that me imposing that on them. They were just really funny, and it was a tool for survival and resilience, I believe. My favorite moment of the film, I didn't put up here, is when Maria and Hannah and they're all sitting around, and there's Maria holds up a little bit of booze, shoots it back, or says, "Goodbye, brains, see you tomorrow," and shoots it back. And I'm like, oh God, that's got to be in this trailer, you know, but. Or on a T-shirt. It was great, but so part of the challenge as a filmmaker was to represent the complexity of the reality in the zone, that suffering and death and there have been thousands and thousands of deaths related to Chernobyl live alongside resilience and love of motherland and moonshine. So somehow we've gotten to that picture. Going back to Maria here. No, there we go. All right. Sorry, guys. We're having some. This is when I love the fact that there's multiple cameras going on because this can be edited. Okay. We're taking a left turn here. These are called stalkers. They are a group of young people, mostly Ukrainians, mostly men, who sneak into the zone to pursue, some of them, radioactive thrills. They have dosimeters. They are searching for the buried machinery dumps where the machinery used after the accident was put because it was radioactive. Some of them are imitating a video game, which is set inside the zone. And others, let's see here, are going to, this is a radioactive machinery dump. They'll put their dosimeters on the machinery and see how high it can go, and then they will sprint off. Very reckless behavior. This is an interior shot of the town of Pripyat. So there are many villages in the zone, but there's only one city, and this was the company town of the nuclear power plant. And in this city, Residents were evacuated about a day and a half after the accident. They were told they were going to be gone 3 days. They were, in fact, gone forever. So the city is this kind of elegiac still life that the stalkers sneak into and explore. It's a ghost city now. It is one of the most radioactive places in the zone. But I think some of them are reckless, adventurers. But I do think that, like the babushkas, the stalkers are driven by a yearning for place and home and belonging. I mean, you do have to remember that most of them are in their 20s, early 30s. They had never seen the villain at the center of the tragedy that devastated their generation, their parents' generation, often took the lives of their grandparents. And so, in a way, they go in to see the reactor, and they go in to find pioneer camps, the Soviet camps that they went to as children, and to sort of look back at the past to find their place moving forward. One stalker told me that his grandfather was an engineer in the Chernobyl control room the night of the accident. He was put in prison immediately after the accident and got out and immediately died of cancer. Another worked for fighting the fire after the accident. So they do have, everybody there seems to have, in terms of everybody, but the stalkers as well, have ties. Now this is the Chernobyl, this is an amusement park in Pripyat that is now, falling to pieces, and the stalkers do go there as well. Kind of a holy grail for the stalkers is the rooftop of the Pripyat buildings. You can see that nature has taken over there. It was it was a pretty big city with a couple 100,000 people, I think. And so just like the animals have returned to the zone, nature has begun to take over. And you can get a look at that there. When I talked to some members of the panel a couple of weeks ago, one person mentioned that displacement can actually change one's genes. And I got to thinking about the stalkers in this context, because they are in the most dangerous places in the zone. They are young, and radioactive contaminants negatively affect them more than older people. And they have sort of the double whammy of being in a place that can mess with your cellular makeup, as well as, and changing your DNA because of the displacement. So I thought that was quite interesting, maybe something we can talk about in the panel afterwards. This is another shot from the roof. You can see they romanticize this activity quite a bit too. This group of women lived their entire lives together in a town called Mashevo, a village called Mashevo. They went through their weddings, births, sending people off to the army together, everything, their whole lives together. But when I talked to them, this is what they said. We remember, we had everything in the forest. Our children will remember, but their children will never know. The stalkers represent the generational impact of displacement. And now that generation is who the babushkas are truly worried about. Home is the entire cosmos of the rural babushka, and connection to the land is really palpable. Perhaps because these Ukrainian women were schooled under the Soviets and versed in the Russian poets. Aphorisms about this slip easily and often from their lips. If you leave, you die. Those who left are worse off now. Motherland is motherland. I will never leave. Now, curiously, what sounds like faith might actually be fact. This is a doctor at the Chernobyl Medical Center. Now, he was telling me about a study that showed that those who left, those who accepted relocation, actually died earlier than those who stayed, by some estimates up to 10 years. I mean, this is not to diminish the very real dangers of radiation. There have been in terms of the deaths from Chernobyl, there have been, Greenpeace says 4,000, the World Health Organization says 4,000. Greenpeace puts the number of eventual Chernobyl deaths in the tens of thousands. So again, not to minimize that, but what he was talking about is a complicated equation. The returnees did not suffer relocation trauma, which means they avoided what relocated people suffer everywhere: higher levels of alcoholism, depression, and importantly, disrupted social networks. So the people who accepted relocation were in these soulless high-rises in the outskirts of Kiev, separated from all that was important to them: the gardens, the graves of their children, the sound of stork wings on a spring afternoon. And there are real consequences to that. So his summary about those people who were relocated was simply, they die of anguish. So it turns out home and community are forces that can rival even radiation. And the film I was making, when I went into it, I was thinking, okay, this is a film about radiation, this is about nuclear disaster, this is some interesting people helping to tell that story. But in fact, it ended up not being about that. In fact, it ended up being a film about home. Radiation may be the invisible enemy, but home was the elixir. And I wanted to show you this woman's home because it typifies so much. Her name's Valentina. She had thyroid cancer, and place was definitely her antidote. On his deathbed, her husband made her promise to never leave her home. Now, she said to me, as I was kind of leaving with sort of twinkle in her eye, "Up in the attic, I have 5 jugs of moonshine. When I die, my kids won't have to buy any." And she sort of typified a lot. I mean, a comment full of suffering, home, resilience, pragmatism, faith. Now, radiation or not, the women of the zone are at the end of their lives. In the next decade, the zone's human residents will be gone, and it will revert to a wild, radioactive place full only of animals and occasionally daring, flummoxed scientists or reckless, searching stalkers. But the spirit and existence of the babushkas leave us with powerful new templates to think about and to grapple with, about the relative nature of risk, about transformative connections to home, and about the palliative powers of place, the vital importance of agency and self-determination. To answer my question from the beginning, what's worth saving in a radioactive wasteland, these are the things worth saving from Chernobyl and building into our notions of community in the future. So those are my final thoughts, but let's end on the words of Valentina Ivanivna, a first responder the night of the accident, and also a nurse, an herbalist, and most importantly, an angler.
Це не є зона лишення свободи. А в Києві я б уже, вмерла б давно, може, 5 разів, не раз. Там вихлопні гази більше, ніж може навіть тут. Тому що кожна машина вихлопне таблицю Менделєєва, а ви її вдихнете в свої легкі. Кушать. Ви хімію всяку разну кушаєте. Це не є здорово, це не є хорошо. Но зона відчуження, тут жизнь не прекращається, однако все равно. Природа бере своє. І річка тече так само, і рибака живе так само. Нікуди не поїду, хай мене під пістолетом.
Thank you.
And now, please welcome to the stage our TrustLive responders, Bonnie McDonald, Nikos Salingaros, Anna RICKLIN, and our moderator, David J. Brown.
Holly, thank you for sharing that wonderful tale with us. And if you haven't watched the Babushkas of Chernobyl, please, please look at it. It's a fabulous story. And the last comment there reminded me about the importance of perspective in this. And I remember one of the other comments that one of the women made, and they said, when you come to a puddle, some people look down and they see the sky. Some people look down and they see themselves, and some people just see a puddle. And I think the perspective that these women bring to place and to their lives and to their health and what's important to them is really important. We've been having some wonderful conversations around health here at Pass Forward in Chicago, and we're delighted to have this conversation today. It's interesting that in our vision for the future of preservation, we talk about the need to collaborate with new partners in working on fundamental issues that help make the world better. And health is one of those fundamental issues. And for our conversation that we have today, we're partnering with a filmmaker, an activist, an author, the leader of one of the country's most effective and active statewide preservation organizations, a mathematician, an urbanist, and a public health specialist, transportation planner, and nutritionist. So I think we've actually brought together a really interesting partnership to have this conversation around health. As Holly said, her film began as a story about nuclear disaster and ended up being a film about home. So I'd like to ask each of our responders to speak about your work and how you see that connection between place and home contributing to well-being. And I'm going to start with Anna.
Oh, good. Well, good morning, everyone. So in my current role as a public health professional working in the context of urban planning and transportation, I'm really thinking about how can we bring a health perspective to everything that we're doing when it comes to the built environment. So how, when we're planning where our streets are laid out or what land uses are going to be, can we make sure that health is first and foremost brought to the table, and how we're thinking about the people who are going to be occupying those spaces. For a long time, especially in the United States and throughout the world, as the United States is such an influencer throughout the world, I think we were focused mostly on moving cars, not people, and the economic development outcomes as the most important metrics for the success of our cities. And we've come to realize that it really is more about the people and our health and the potential of the people that live in our cities to actually, and other places too, rural environments. We need to think more about and how the potential of those people to live the highest quality of life is actually what's going to be the most successful, lead to the most success for all of us. And that can't just be the wealthy and it can't just be the middle class, it has to be everyone. So I'm currently at the American Planning Association, where we are training planners, educating planners, working with planners at all levels to help them, guide them, and give them tools to better include health and a health perspective and a human perspective in their work, no matter what scale they're working at. And I think that topics like this film really connect health and place in very stark ways among particular populations, and allow us to think about how people are all individuals, but yet we have these common needs that we all need to think about.
Great. Nikos?
Yes, well, it's lovely to be here, and I have seen the film The Babuskas of Chernobyl, very moving film. When I was invited to come here, I had a misunderstanding. I thought I was coming to a mathematics conference. So I prepared a mathematical model to try to explain why the babushkas return, and especially to explain why the babushkas that returned lived longer than the ones that were relocated. So if you bear with me, I will put into place a mathematical model that considers the quality of life based on 3 factors, and each factor contributes 1/3, and when we add the thirds, we get 1, which is the optimal. So the first factor comes from belonging and memory and the identity of place, which is fundamental to a conference such as this one. So obviously, the film shows that there's memory of place going back to several generations of these people. Everyone who was relocated for their own safety was severed from this source of healing and continuity, deeply rooted. So that 1/3 was removed from their lives. The babushkas who returned were there, and that was a contributing factor towards their health, the rootedness, being back to the rootedness. Now, another factor is the geometry of the environment, which is what I talked about yesterday in the other session, which is the neurological responses we have from the environment, namely a lot of nature, these idyllic scenes. If you ignore the radioactivity, these are idyllic scenes surrounded by nature. More importantly, there is the pedestrian environment, something that is very important for the health of people in cities. Here you have a totally pedestrian environment, and the architecture is one that was self-constructed. These shacks that some architects look down on are created by their own hands. These people created the houses by their own hands, and they're all wonderfully adaptive to their life, made of wood. These are a source of the other 1/3 of a healing reaction that people who live in these buildings, because they have been built by their grandfathers in some cases, and they're at a human level, and they're taking care of them. They may be a little dilapidated, but that's a 1/3 in addition. So to show what the model has for the babushkas who did return, we have 1/3 plus 1/3, which gives us 2/3 of quality of life, and that's it's a nourishing environment. Of course, the other 1/3 that's missing is that it's unhealthy because it's radioactive. Now, let me use the model for the people who were relocated. They were relocated to Soviet-style housing blocks. There is absolutely no healing effect from the architectural urban environment. It's usually isolated blocks, even though the pedestrians, the distances are huge, it's totally unfriendly. So you're missing the 1/3 because they are detached from their history and from the places where they grew up. They're detached, there is no connection to the actual building and the city. So they have plus 1/3 because there's no radioactivity. But 1/3 is less than 2/3. So that explains why the babushkas who stayed have a longer life.
We were going to bring a blackboard in and let Nikos put all that up.
I was saying I wish I'd met him, at the beginning. This probably would have saved 2 years of my life.
Yeah.
It's like
it's never too
I talked
late.
to a mathematician before I started the next part.
Bonnie, tell us a bit about what you're working on and how it makes this connection between place and wellness.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I represent Landmarks Illinois, which is the statewide historic preservation organization here in Illinois. And so I'm like many of you. I'm trying to find, with my team, practical ways to apply any type of argument that we can make to articulate the importance of place to people. And so I would say that we're always, as a field, opportunistic in that we're willing to look at new ways of giving a narrative to the importance of what we do. So at Landmarks Illinois, we've been talking for at least the last 5 years about how to evolve the way that we're expressing the importance of place to people. And frankly, the first thing that we did was to really question why we do what we do. I think that we need to better understand the intrinsic value of preservation. And frankly, to me, as a preservationist, it's about providing a place for people, but for the role that buildings and places and structures play in our lives and how we use them. I wonder the value of what we do. And that in some ways might be controversial, but I think that the usefulness of places is very important to us. So we started to turn our work on its head and talk about people saving places for people. And we adopted that as our mantra and thought first about people, which was very different than where we started.
Yes.
As an organization in 1971. Like many of you, we probably started to save the edifice, to save the beautiful place. And I think now if we think about how the place is a vessel for our own identity, it gives a new narrative to what we do. So as we're trying in our way and collectively here to evolve the preservation movement, I think this is the next iteration of what we do, is the fact that place is inherently an indicator of identity, or that identity is tied to place. As I'm sure we'll talk about Dr. Mindy Fulalove, the idea that identity and place are intrinsic or inextricably linked. And so our role is invariably to help people understand and, I think, connect with their own identity. So we don't know yet how to do that well. So I'm just going to say to you that we're learning and we're evolving how we do that. And that's why I'm very excited about this topic as part of the conference.
Thanks, Bonnie. I'd like to build on that and ask Holly, in your work for 2 years with the babushkas, what did you find out in terms of that importance of memory and place to their well-being? You talked about it a little bit, but if you can expand some on how they, that connection.
Well, so just to know, to clarify, it took 5 years to make the film. Thought I'd save 2 with the math. But so yes, memory and place were inextricably wed. And that sort of revealed itself throughout the process. Again, I went in thinking, there's the reactor, there's this kind of ruin porn, these broken down buildings, there's all these things, and visually as a filmmaker you're thinking that. But the story quickly became very human. And you can, the women, the women who stayed there and the women who relocated were constantly articulating their connection to the soil and to place. My child is buried there. My parents are there. There's a whole scene in the graveyard which is, lovely, not just sad. And so it becomes everything to them. And of course, with the babushkas, it will die with them. This region of Ukraine called the Polisia region, the customs and the songs and everything that we saw will go with them, and hopefully this film will help preserve some of it. But yeah, at every step of the way, it was tied to the land, to motherland, which is particularly fierce in that part of the world.
Yeah. In one of the earlier learning labs on the health track, there was this conversation around how we experience our environment. And the comment was made, it's not just a visual or ocular experience, but it's a whole body experience. And I got that sense watching the film and seeing the women farming, fishing, going to the graveyard, the Easter Mass they celebrated. It really was a whole body experience. And Anne, I'm interested because you're working in this intersection of place and how people interact with place, and be interested in hearing your thoughts about how people react to place and perhaps what that means for people like preservationists who care about places and the like.
I think place has so much to do with how you orient yourself in the world. There was a really touching and very, I just caught this line in the film that when I watched the full-length film that really impacted me and my heart. And it was this woman who said when she had been relocated, she woke up in the morning and the sun was rising on the wrong side. And of course the sun was still rising in the east, but it was the wrong side of the building from where she had been used to the sun rising in her home. And it really touched me because how we orient ourselves in place and space when we enter a building or we enter a courtyard or a plaza or some kind of space, we immediately orient ourselves. We use multiple senses, not just our eyes, but and when we're navigating through streets and when we're orienting ourselves in a new city and trying to figure out where we are and where does the sun rise in the city, and oh, there's this mountain, so I know that that's west. And when we don't have those orientation points, we feel very out of sorts. And I think, our phones offer us a little bit of an orientation point now. And I think actually, just as an aside, having the map in your pocket is actually really good for planners because now people are so much more oriented to place in a mappy kind of way. But it has everything to do with your health and everything to do with your sense of security and your sense of stability to walk into a place, whether it be an entire landscape or a building, and be able to orient yourself. And if you can't do that, or if it's so new and you're so not used to it, then you feel destabilized. And I think that has an impact. It could have a short-term stress impact, but if it's over the long term, that chronic stress is going to have an impact on your health.
So I'd be interested in Bonnie and Nico sort of picking up on that. If this is true about the whole body experience, what does that mean for how preservationists think about environments and our work?
Well, it's very clear. Preservationists should strive to save those places that give the maximally healing whole body experience to a large variety of viewers. Unofficial experiments show that as far as positive whole body experience, 90% of different people agree completely that a particular place has very high degree of whole body experience. So it has nothing to do with individuals. People from different cultures, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds will agree with 90% that this place is, yes, has a tremendously healing experience, and of course that's the place that has to be saved by all these mechanisms. So the same people will agree that another place will have a very low degree of healing experience, if not to create anxiety, in which case there's no reason to save such a.
What are some of the features of those places where 90% of the people agree that it's a positive experience?
Well, that's a two-part question. The first and best test is neurological tests where we wire up subjects with body monitors, and then they measure the body's responses. If it's positive, then it's positive. If it's negative, it creates anxiety, stress, flight or fight syndrome. So that's the best scientific test. A second and totally different way of judging it is to use mathematical criteria developed by Christopher Alexander and myself. So instead of doing the experiments, you just evaluate the structure and the biophilic qualities, and you have a checklist, and then you look at the fractal qualities of the environment and the applicability of certain geometrical patterns, and that gives you a clear indication of whether it's healing or the opposite.
Yeah. Bonnie?
Yes, David, I was thinking about the work that we do, and knowing that place is important to people is really intrinsic. I think we all know in our hearts that, and can see that the people that we work with on a daily basis are tied to these places. When we get those calls, thousands of calls from people every year, it's because they love and they are tied to their places. And that losing them comes with a sense of mourning. But it's harder for us to give a voice to why sustaining that place in a scientific way. We don't have the science yet, or the metrics, or the narrative to talk about this. And that's why Holly's film helps us, is to give us more of that narrative. Rather, I think we've become so used to talking about loss of place. And we grieve with people. I mean, how many of you have gone through a really challenging preservation battle? And we are battle torn. And coming out of that in a place that we may have never used ourselves or known, it becomes something that is beloved to us because we were there with people on a day-to-day basis. And so I think we feel a sense of mourning and loss with them. And I give you an example here locally of how we've come to know that. Yesterday, I went out with a field session to talk about public housing in Chicago. And our specific story in Chicago is that we had 25,000 units of public housing built. And in 2000, the Chicago Housing Authority determined that the best approach to remake housing was to demolish almost all of it. And the displacement, generational displacement of people has a physiological mental effect on them through generations. So I think the University of Chicago is actually studying that change in DNA, which will indicate how multiple displacement events in a family can profoundly impact them and their sense of security and identity for generations to come.
I'm glad you brought up about displacement, and Holly mentioned it in her talk as well, because it's a key issue here. And I wonder if, as preservationists, we need to be thinking more about the tools to try and make sure that communities are not displaced with the work we do. I'd be interested in, Holly, if maybe you could start in talking about sort of displacement in general and how you saw that, the impacts of that with the residents of the zone. And then we can talk a bit about how preservationists are reacting to that and maybe how we can build some new tools.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about it regionally too, because, you know, as an American, I've moved maybe 20, 25 times in my life. I have a closer connection to my laptop than any piece of soil, which is probably the case for a lot of us here. But in other regions and in other countries and communities, it's really different. And so, yes, we often talk about it as loss, but it's interesting to think about it as building from the start. You know, if we are as we're moving forward, building in some of that. But I mean, having spoken to the women who were not displaced and to the women who were displaced, what I heard in the displaced people was just still immediate visceral sadness about not being where they were from. One group of women, their village was one of the villages that was buried at the time of the accident, completely buried. It didn't exist. They didn't have the option of going home. So they were put into a village. It's this sort of self-created place. A lot of them experienced discrimination, being Chernobylites, as they're called. You know, some communities didn't want them there. So there would become these sort of satellite, quickly constructed villages. Anyway, the idea was that yearning and that brokenness never left after, in the case, 50 years for these folks I was talking to. So it's the long game, isn't it?
Yeah. Anna, are you seeing work at the APA to try and deal with issues of displacement, either to keep it from happening or where it's happened to deal with those who are displaced? It's been successful?
It is a huge issue. And there was actually an amazing session on this yesterday about gentrification and displacement here at this conference, which if you didn't catch it, I hope it was recorded. It was really good. It's really hard to cite success stories. I think that there's pockets of success stories of cities identifying ahead of time that there is starting to be speculation in a neighborhood, for example, and thinking about, oh, we better get ahead of this and try to ensure that there are policies in place, or at least some kind of ordinance that requires, if any new builders come, that they have to include a certain percentage of affordable housing in the new units that they're building, for example. But that's really in small pockets. I know there's a project in Denver that's done really well with that, with revitalizing a neighborhood and ensuring that the residents, I believe it's called Sun Valley, that the residents that lived there before are still living there and still can afford to live there and don't have to pay exorbitant taxes, et cetera, on their homes, even though there's tons of new construction and new residents coming in. But it's a huge struggle, and I think we need to be thinking more about creative financing mechanisms that planners together with financiers and other, thinking about other creative sources of funding to ensure that people can remain in their homes and don't get displaced and pushed out by some of these very significant market forces. And actually, the flip side of that is something else I've been thinking about that Holly touched upon, which is immigrants coming to places. So we're concerned about people being displaced from the neighborhoods that they've lived in for generations. But we're also dealing with, many of our places across the United States are dealing with the influx of new Americans and how to deal with them and all of the social challenges that come with that. So I think together these are really, really challenging questions that planners, to be honest, have a number of tools, but have not come up with a system for approaching it. It really has to be, this is where planning is hyper-local. It really is a place to place, and you can replicate policies, but you have to adapt as well.
And I know on that last point, preservationists can play a role in this. The Lower East Side Tenement Museum, which is a National Trust historic site in New York City, has been working on immigrants coming in and helping that transition as they're coming in. I think that's part of what you were talking about. We've only got about 5 minutes left. I want to just make sure we get a couple of things in. This probably could be an hour conversation, but Nikos, I wonder if you could just touch on briefly what you know about the connections between mental health and physical health and that well-being from the work you've been doing.
Well, mental health is intricately linked to physical health. The state of the body is determined by all these systems that we have, the nervous system, the hormonal system, that is influenced by the neurological input that we obtain all the time. That creates a state of the body that will either weaken the body and make it sick, or it will reinforce the body and help it to fight external pathogens. So there is no separate systems. It's one system that has different subsystems, like in your car. Okay, everything has to work together. Everything does work together.
Right. Well, I'm gonna ask everyone sort of a final question, and we're obviously learning a great deal about health and well-being, and we're just starting to apply it to older places, older buildings, older communities. What are the questions that we should be asking as a preservation community to learn more about the connections and how we can focus on the benefits of older buildings and if there are shortcomings of those places as well? What are some of the questions we should be asking? I'll let anyone. Bonnie, you can start with that one.
I'll be happy to jump off and start us off with I think the question that we always need to be asking are, who are the partners with whom we can work to better understand how our collaborative role can have impact? Because we don't necessarily have to become experts in public health to have a significant and role full of impact for those working in this area. And I wanted to take a moment to again, give a practical application of this, in that we've just begun working with the Department of Public Health here in the city of Chicago, which put together a very ambitious plan called Healthy Chicago 2.0. I know Nick Prashant is in the audience who helped to author that plan, and there's Nick right there. And he and his colleagues looked at the indicators of health, which you would expect for a public health agency to do, and they looked at the built environment as a specific having a role and being an indicator of health. And so we've started to partner with them on place-based initiatives that are pertaining to especially the significant and increased levels of lead in young children of color in the city of Chicago, because they tend to live in housing that is not maintained, sometimes absentee landlordship, and is aged. So it has a preponderance of lead-based paint, which we know a lot about. So we can play a role in helping to advise about the remediation of lead-based paint in a way that also protects the historic integrity to give an authentic place to that identity in the community, but also looking at ways to create job creation around this industry as well. So that would have a positive impact on wealth creation in the neighborhood. So just to say, that's one example of where I think that we can contribute and be partners.
That's great. Well, I want to thank all of you for this very exciting and thought-provoking conversation. It's been terrific. And I want to ask all of you to continue the conversation at our learning labs and online at Pass Forward. And we really appreciate you being here. Would you join me in giving a round of thanks to our responders and our speakers?